Libya's Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibah has rejected Parliament's decision to appoint a new premier to head the country's transitional government. Lawmakers said that they would name a new Prime Minister to replace Dbeibah after Libya failed to hold its first presidential elections during his watch.
Dbeibah was installed as Prime Minister through a UN-backed peace process on the understanding his government would oversee the run-up to presidential and parliamentary elections in December. Dbeibah said the transitional government of national unity that he heads remains valid despite the collapse in December of a planned election process. He has rejected moves by Parliament to take control of it.
My beloved people, I want to announce today that I will not allow new transitional periods. We will not retreat from our role in government, which we pledged to the people until elections are achieved. Also, the National Unity Government will continue its work until power is handed over to an elected government. We will not allow this dominated entity to dominate the scene and endanger our country and the future of our people once again.
The parliament, which was elected in 2014, has called the unity government invalid. On Monday, Parliament adopted a new roadmap, including a new interim government before elections next year. The UN Libya advisor and Western powers have said they still recognize the unity government. They've urged Libya's competing factions and political institutions to prioritize early elections rather than a new transitional period. At stake is a UN-backed peace process, including a ceasefire that has held since summer 2020, with rival armed forces mobilizing in Tripoli over recent weeks.
Well, for more on this, we're now joined by Sami Hamdi, who's the editor-in-chief of International Interest. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Sami. Always good to get your insights on this. I guess the moment those elections failed to happen, we were going to get to this point about Dbeibah's future and how this interim government was going to continue or constitute.
Precisely. I think that it's important, first of all, to remember that none of the Libyan factions actually wanted elections. So when the elections were delayed, the parties considered it a victory for themselves, and we entered into the next stage, which is this political wrangling that we're seeing. In order to understand the significance of what's unfolding before us with regards to attempts to change the premier or attempts to change the prime minister, we have to remember that in 2015 there was a UN brokered agreement. There was then a UN brokered government that was supposed to rule for 1 year as a transition period, and it ended up ruling for 5 years. And this is why Dbeibah's rivals are moving very quickly to try to remove Dbeibah, essentially on this belief that elections are not going to happen anytime soon, and therefore whoever is prime minister is going to have a lengthy period of time within which to entrench themselves. Dbeibah wants to use this period to entrench himself, and his rivals want to undercut him and remove him and put instead their own allies as prime minister instead. And that's why it's noteworthy that one of the candidates who is being touted by the parliament, and we should use this term very loosely given that it's a parliament that's been around for 7 years, and the only reason it's still around is because there hasn't been any elections, so its legitimacy is questionable at best. But nevertheless, the candidate that is being proposed by parliament is somebody who was part of the efforts by Haftar to establish some sort of political consensus whereby he can storm back to political power. You'll remember in the aftermath of the elections, when the elections were cancelled, there was an awkward meeting between a number of what many people would term as the losers of the original political process. They all gathered around Haftar in Benghazi, and Bashara, who is one of the candidates being proposed by parliament, is one of them. So what we're seeing now is sort of a policy. There is a famous Arabic saying in North Africa, نلعب ولا نخرب. Either I play or I burn the whole house down. So what the rivals are saying is we are not going to allow Dbeibah to use what they consider to be a transitional government whose legitimacy has ended. Remember, the government was only supposed to rule for a year because they were expecting elections. They are essentially saying to Dbeibah, we will not allow you this space to entrench yourself. We want instead to put somebody else who we like, who will be able to entrench themselves in our favor. So what's happening is not necessarily a battle over what is right or what is just or what is legitimate or what is fair or what is democratic. what is happening instead is there is a real fear amongst Dbeibah's allies, amongst Haftar, amongst Aguila Saleh, amongst these other various individuals. There's a genuine fear that if they do not remove Dbeibah as prime minister of this government, he will end up ruling for 4 or 5 years. He will entrench himself in the state apparatus with international support, and somebody who was a complete outsider a year ago will suddenly become the dominant force in Libya and upend everything in their faces. And this is what the reasoning behind this move. We've seen the parliament in Tobruk, the parliament that was voted by 18% of the electorate. It was a very low turnout that was then subsequently kicked out of Tripoli by militias. We're seeing this parliament led by Haftar and Aguila Saleh essentially saying, bring Dbeibah down, we're going to put our own allies. And we're seeing the international community, I use that term loosely, the United States, Britain, France, and the others, sort of saying, we're not going to allow this. We can see this political play for what it is. Dbeibah stays in place until there's elections. Essentially, their belief is that if they stick by Dbeibah, then they can subvert the efforts of Dbeibah's rivals, who are the instigators of making sure that elections don't take place. The international community believes that if they do not concede, or if they manage to rescue Dbeibah's government, then they have a stronger hand to force elections. And if Dbeibah falls, then elections will become a much more far-fetched prospect. Whether that analysis is correct or not is a different question. But the point here, and then to summarize, the point here is that this is not about democracy. This is about rivals fearing that Dbeibah will become too strong if he stays in his current position.
All right, so he does enjoy some international support. If he refuses to go, can anybody force him from his office?
I think that what's very interesting is that for the first time since the conflict began, we saw a visit by Turkish diplomats to Benghazi, i.e. to Haftar's stronghold. We saw the visits by Turkish diplomats who are now talking with Dbeibah's rivals. We also know that Bashara, who is the nomination of the parliament to take Dbeibah's place, was once not necessarily a darling of Turkey, but did have very good relations with Turkey. So there is this suggestion on the part of the international community that perhaps the international allies who support Dbeibah may be open to the idea of a government reshuffle if it fends off the prospect of war. In other words, if holding on to Dbeibah means that we're back to the precipice of war, where the militia start mobilizing again, then to avoid that war, it's better to establish a political consensus government, reshuffle the government, remove Dbeibah, or keep Dbeibah and hamstring him by nominating his allies, nominating his rivals' allies. So we're seeing this sort of dialogue taking place that wasn't taking place before, between the international powers that support Dbeibah and between the international powers that support Haftar and Aguila Saleh on the other side. And that's why the parliament is actually encouraged in trying to bring down Dbeibah, because they believe there's a possibility that Turkey, which is the real power on the ground in Tripoli, which is what has supplied the drones, what has supplied the armed forces that allowed Dbeibah to stay in power, or at least allow the government of national accord to operate and protect itself from the likes of Haftar, who's keen on a military campaign. Turkey is not keen on a particular individual as much as it's keen on preserving its military gains. If Dbeibah can no longer protect those and Bashara can protect it, Turkey will gladly get rid of Dbeibah and support any bid to bring in Bashara if Bashara can guarantee Turkey's gains. In other words, the emphasis here is not on Dbeibah for the international powers. The emphasis is twofold. For Turkey, it's about protecting its gains, and for the US, it's about making sure the country doesn't go back to war in order to keep the political process alive. If Dbeibah's presence threatens either of these, he will be removed. And I think that the reality is that the US is far more pragmatic than it is principled. While ostensibly we are hearing talk about elections and preserving the transition process and preserving this government because it represents the transition process, US is exceptionally pragmatic. Remember, the US allowed Haftar to conduct his military campaign to seize Tripoli on the basis that a military solution might finally bring an end to the war. And when that failed, it rushed in to establish a political process. It's this pragmatism that raises question marks, in that while today the international community seems firm in that Dbeibah should stay and the government of national unity should stay as it is, everybody else in the Libyan factions who are used to the pragmatism of the international community believe anything is possible And it appears that Dbeibah's rivals now are mounting a serious challenge, saying we don't want Dbeibah in power, we want to put our own candidates. And now the test is on the resolve of the international community, whether they will hold on to Dbeibah or not.
Prime Minister Dbeibah says that if there's a new Prime Minister named, there will be chaos and division. Is that a fair assessment? What will happen to Libya if a new PM is named?
Before the elections were cancelled, there was talk that if Aguila Saleh in the east did not get his way, then he would establish an alternative government, or rather a government that would be an alternative to Dbeibah's government, and that government would rule in the east, even if it didn't necessarily rule in the west. In other words, there's a suggestion that perhaps a government will be formed in the east. The problem, of course, is that none of the banks in the east have enough money anymore to sustain a new government or sustain a new state. There's an economic crisis now in Libya, not just in the west, but also in the east. And you'll remember how much it costs to the upkeep for Haftar to maintain his army, and also the mercenaries that are there. So while Aguila Saleh likes to threaten the prospect of an alternative government, that is quite tough to implement. But when Dbeibah talks about chaos, I think it's important to put it into context in that Libya is already in chaos. No one knows if elections are even going to happen. Militias are wrestling in Tripoli and wrestling elsewhere, trying to seize more territory to secure greater leverage in anticipation of a new political process, not an election. They're anticipating a new political process that might form a new government. Dbeibah's had to rely on Turkey to help him keep order in Tripoli, deploying troops to try to prevent militias from reaching Tripoli. So there is chaos as it is. When Dbeibah talks about further chaos, it's hard to imagine what he means unless it's all-out war. But the reality is that what we're seeing unfolding now in Libya is greater uncertainty and a lack of direction. Nobody knows what the next step should be. And suddenly we're seeing less talks about elections and more talks about rescuing the transition process. What that means is very vague, whether that's a new political process. But the problem, of course, with the political process is that we had one 2015, we had one 2020, now we're talking about a new one. It seems to be this never-ending cycle, given that the Libyan factions quite simply do not want to engage with one another in order to establish elections. And then, of course, you get to the crux of the issue, which is that the international community that is calling for elections is the very international community that is enabling the Libyan actors to subvert the bid for elections. When Haftar is able to go to Paris to get what he wants, or go to Moscow, and the Dbeibah can go to Ankara, and the other can go to Washington, the other can go to London, the other can go to the like, it is this phenomenon of being able to play the international powers off one another that ensures that the Libyan factions always have enough power to subvert the bid for elections. And this is why one of the greatest criticisms today coming out of Libya is that to this day we are still not dealing with Libya as it is, and we're still dealing with Libya in a manner of how we want it to be. And the greatest evidence of that is the fact the elections that Libyan factions and Libyans were crying out for ages, saying this is very unlikely to happen, but Washington tried to superimpose it. It failed to superimpose it. The Libyan factions got their way. There's no elections. And now they're pushing for their way again to ensure that no elections happen, and that instead power is divided and shared like a cake between them as they dominate and subvert the will of the Libyan people, who are actually at one point very excited about the elections and changing the political landscape.
Sami, we're going to have to leave it there. As always, your insights always so greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time.